Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with Donald Gault, our wisdom dialogue based on his years of experience in public health at Ramsey County. And one of the things we want to talk about is what does it take to work in a healthy work environment, to create a healthy work environment? So many times nowadays you hear people talking about things are just so toxic at my workplace. And so he's got a little bit of experience and wisdom he's going to share with us on what are some of the essential elements ingredients that go into a healthy work environment. And I think you'll enjoy what he has to say.
Thank you, Dan. Well, when we talk about many years, I'm going to actually be sharing a few ideas that are based on my work in Ramsey County, but also based on going quite a bit further back than that. In the early 70s, I did work in hospitals, actually in the Chicago area, and I grew up in a family of healthcare providers. My mom was a nurse and my father was a surgeon. And so when I look at what's going on in the healthcare system specifically today and people working in healthcare, frankly, it really makes me sad. And when we talk about the years, just to frame this, when I started working for Ramsey County, it was 2 months before our son was born. So it's over 29 years ago, and our son was born 2 months after I started there. So essentially, the entire time I worked for Ramsey County was the lifespan of my son up until the time that I left the county. And what's, I think, really striking about that is that in my life, the most important thing to me is my family. And yet, over the course of those 29 years working full-time for the county, I probably spent more at least waking hours with the people that I was working with than I did with the family that meant the most to me. And I'm not saying that in a negative way, but I'm just saying that it really is striking that we spend so much time at work and with people in our workplaces, and yet I think sometimes don't pay enough attention to how to help make that work in a healthy manner. In my work with Ramsey County, we did a lot of work on working with organizations around the community to create healthy and respectful work environments as a strategy to prevent family violence, interestingly. And so I'm going to share some of the really kind of key things that I learned in both in my life and in doing that work over these many years. The first one is that when we look at what goes on in our workplaces, and if you've ever come home one day and talked about maybe a particularly frustrating day, most likely what the focus of that frustration is on is an individual or a group of people, and it's about relationships with people, and we really feel either disrespected or that somebody acted in a way that was inappropriate, or an organization acted in a way that was inappropriate. And so we look at the relationship part, and in fact, in our work in Ramsey County and working with workplaces, both healthcare and other workplaces around the community, usually the calls would come in saying, we need to have some communication training or some training on how people can get along better with each other. And I don't know how you train people to get along better with each other, but as we started doing the work, the first thing that we applied was an idea that comes from an organizational development consultant named James Shank. And he says that when we look at organizations, while we usually see the problems that we want to change manifest in relationships, that in fact there are three things that are driving those, many if not most of those relationship problems. Lack of clarity and agreement about three very basic things: goals, roles, and process. Goals, what are we doing and why do we do this? Roles, who does what and how do we interact with each other in this workplace that we're in? And then process, how do we actually get this thing done? How does it work? And he says that when we look at organizations, we need to have clarity and agreement on those three things. And my learning on what it means to have agreement on them isn't necessarily that you and I agree, absolutely this is the number one thing I want to do, but instead we agree that while we work together here, this is our goal. This is what the goal is that we're working on. Now that may seem either real obvious and simple or daunting and impossible, or maybe a bit of both. But what I learned from my work in both doing community work in Ramsey County, but also being a manager of a group of people in Ramsey County, is that I worked really hard on, at least with the group of people that I worked with, always being real aware of trying to think about and talk about goals, roles, and process. And the last thing I want to say on that is that sometimes when we agree and have agreement and clarity on it, it's agreement that we don't know. And that's okay too. It's fine to be able to say, we're really not exactly sure right now on either, again, goals, or we're not sure on roles because somebody just left and it's going to be a little out of sorts for a while, but at least by naming that, it helps people be a lot more clear on where they are and feel more comfortable in their workplace. Going back to, I think, some of what we talked about earlier about that whole notion of people not acting well when they feel powerless, when we're not clear in our workplaces and in our immediate work groups about things like goals, roles, and process, it can often leave us feeling powerless. It can leave us feeling very uneasy and then can lead to people's relationships breaking down. The second idea that I want to talk about comes from a woman named Jennifer James, who's a cultural anthropologist who many years ago did a seminar and talked about the importance of stories. And as an anthropologist, talking about how we humans live by our stories. And when we introduce, if you think about, if you go to a party and meet somebody new, or here at the university when you meet new people in your workplace, you'll often tell stories, and there'll be stories both about here's who I am and where I was born and some of my background, and then here's my professional story. So there's like a personal story and a professional story. And in this culture, because we put so much value on our professions, on what we accomplish and what we do and what we're called, that professional story is really important. When I go back in my own family to my father, who practiced medicine in the earlier part of the last century, long story that I won't go into, and my mother, who was a nurse, both of them had very clear stories about what it meant, in his case to be a surgeon, and in her case to be a nurse. And I'm not saying that those stories were necessarily healthy and we need to change systems and all of that's good, but while we're changing systems, we still need to be clear about here's who I am. Here's how my role fits into this larger story and what it means to me. My mom, every day going into work as a nurse at Evanston Hospital, wore a white hat, white uniform, white stockings, and white shoes. And she was very clear about what it meant to be a nurse. I think today, in many places, but certainly in the healthcare field, I think we've lost a lot of those stories and we don't pay attention to them as much. It's less of a compelling story to say that I am a provider of a healthcare product to a client than it is to say I'm a healer. And I don't think these need to be mutually exclusive. We can still have a healthcare delivery system, but we need to allow for people to have their stories and to really embrace those stories and respect them. The third idea that I want to share comes from a gentleman named Dr. Eric Knox, who was an OBGYN physician here in the Twin Cities, and he brought the idea of normalized deviance into my understanding. And he talked about that as we have gradual breakdowns of behavioral, technical, and ethical standards, that, and again, the key thing in there is gradual, that we end up in this, quote, state of normalized deviance. And it's a place where none of us want to be, but it's become normal. So an example, Dan, that I'll give you in a story that I can tell you is quite a few years ago we worked with a local hospital emergency room, and they called up saying that we need training on being more respectful and being better to each other. And it turned out, going through a process of discussion with them to try to really discover what was going on. First of all, we learned that everybody in the organization felt disrespected, both by their peers within that local hospital emergency room and their peers around the hospital and the larger healthcare community. Everyone, the doctors, the nurses, the technicians, the secretaries. The other thing, though, that we learned was that they were engaged in some behaviors that were really pretty unhealthy. Things like yelling at each other and swearing at each other and throwing things at each other to get each other's attention.
Normalized deviance.
Normalized deviance. And when we talked about that with them, nobody said, well, when I was trained to come here and work in this hospital, they taught me to do this. But just over time, especially it's really interesting, if you think about it in an emergency room environment, you have to get people's attention. If you are working on somebody's head and I'm working on their foot and you see something that I don't know, I better listen to or something really bad could happen. So over time, that gradual breakdown was, say, Dan, look here. Say, Dan, look here. Say, Dan, fill in the blank swear word, again, to get your attention. Say, Dan, maybe toss something at you to get your attention. And so we worked with them to really come up with some alternative ways to get each other's attention and to work with each other in a very intentional, respectful way. So again, moving away from the notion of these are bad people, we moved into something about, again, an unhealthy environment that, again, over time, that gradual breakdown had led them to a place where none of them wanted to be. The last person that I want to talk about is a woman named Margaret Thorsborn, who's actually an Australian organizational development consultant, and she talks about a practice, a principle called affect script psychology, and I'm not going to go into that in great depth now, but I would encourage you, if you're interested, Google affect script psychology. It'll take you to something called the Sylvan Tompkins Institute, and it's fascinating stuff. But in its application to workplaces, she talked about that the single most important job of a manager and a supervisor, and I would argue the single most important job of all of us in workplaces together, is to create organizations and environments of interest and enjoyment. Fascinating idea. That idea actually comes out of affect script psychology, and if you read a bit about that study, you'll learn about why that's so important. But the short version is that that is what we all as human animals seek. We seek interest and enjoyment in order to further ourselves as individuals and further ourselves as a collective species. And so I loved that notion, and as a person who was called a manager at Ramsey County, although I was always really careful about that because I didn't want to take on that notion of being above others. But again, accepting the job that I had, the role that I had, I really intentionally looked at my number one job as creating an environment of interest and enjoyment. And what I can tell you, the outcome of that was that my biggest challenge as a manager was making sure people didn't work more hours than we were paying them for because they were so engaged in and loving their work that sometimes they would get a little carried away. And I'd say, you know, it's time to go home for the weekend. So it's a pretty remarkable thing. And again, this isn't just to say I want you to go have fun at work for the sake of having fun at work. It's I want you to have fun at work for the sake of doing your best work. And by intentionally creating environments where we, again, now go through the four things we've talked about, try to be as clear as possible and always open to needing to discuss this thing. Let's clarify goals, roles, and process. What are we doing here? Why do we do it? How do we interact with each other? To really embrace the story of each person, both as an individual and as a practitioner, to look at how things maybe have broken down over time and give people alternative ways to fulfill those same things that they're fulfilling now in maybe an unhealthy way. And then finally, for all of us, to take on that notion of it's our job to create a place of interest and enjoyment. I think by doing those four things intentionally in any workplace, and certainly in healthcare, we are really at a place where we can transform. And we can transform now and into the future.
That's great advice, great wisdom dialogue from Donald Gault. How can people get in touch with you, Donald?
Probably the easiest way is, thank you, to go to my website, which is buildingpeacefulcommunity.org, all one word.
Buildingpeacefulcommunity.org.
Yes.
And they'll get right connected with you.
Yep.
Okay. So it's your turn. I'm known for what I call knowledge work questions, little reflective exercises that I encourage people. And there are 4 questions. The first question is, what concept, tool, resource, or idea resonated with you? You might jot that down. Second question is, how might you use that information? Third question is, why does it matter? And fourth question is, why care? So knowledge work questions. What concept appealed to you? How could you use it? Why is it important? And why care? opportunity for you to do some personal reflection or engage in a conversation with a dialogue with a fellow coworker or a classmate in the event that this is being used in your class. So thanks again, and stay tuned for more Wisdom Dialogues from the Catherine J. Densford International Center for Nursing Leadership at the University of Minnesota School of Nursing.